When I was in elementary school, ominous things were happening around me. It all started back when I was involved in a car accident. Unluckily, I was one of the victims when a car driven by a reckless elderly plowed into the sidewalk while I was leaving school. The injuries were in minor terms of drama, and although I was initially unconscious due to the head injury, I regained consciousness after a few days, and my injuries only took a few weeks to be fully healed. Then, some time after I woke up, I started seeing kids around my age. When I was in hospital and recovered to walk, my mother and father came to visit me almost every day and took me out for walks. Of course, I just walked with my parents around the hospital grounds as means of rehabilitation, but when I walk around the hospital, I sometimes see the child. Glancing around the hospital room where the door was left open, I saw a pale, pigmented child in a patient gown standing at the foot of the bed, pointing at something. At first, I thought that the child was a family member of one of the patients and thought that it was just an odd child. But as I walked around the hospital, I saw children dressed the same way in various places and realized something was wrong. One day, I asked my mother, "Hey, what is that kid?" But my mother asked, "Which child?" And scurrying in the direction I pointed, I understood that my mother could not see the child. I checked with my father if he could see the kid, but he still could not. Perhaps because of this, I was a little scared at night during my hospital stay, and when my parents left, I would always hide under the covers and not leave the hospital room until lights out. However, I was unable to overcome the physiological phenomenon and got up in the middle of the night to use the restroom. I left the hospital room so as not to waken a patient in the same room and walked down the dark corridor with the faint light source of the nightlight floating in the air, heading for the restroom. And I met a child in a patient gown on my way there. When I reached the bathroom, I suddenly caught something in the corner of my eye and turned around to see the child's figure floating unnaturally clearly in front of a certain hospital room at the end of the hallway. Gripping the doorknob of the handrail-shaped toilet, I tensed up. While I keep an eye on the child, eventually the child will gradually raise one arm and point to the hospital room in front of me. At the time, I did not understand the significance of the child's behavior, but I immediately ran to the bathroom. When I went out into the hallway again to relieve myself, I quickly returned to my hospital room and crawled under the covers without looking at the hallway where the child had been. I was scared of that kid anyway. When I woke up the next morning, the hospital was a little noisy, so I asked my roommate, an elderly patient, what had happened. The patient said, "Oh, a person died." He told me in a putty voice after wondering if he should tell that to a kid like me. Even though I am indeed an elementary school student, I know that it is not unusual for people to die in hospitals because I have seen many dramas about it. But for me, the death of a patient in the same hospital was a shock that I couldn't describe. When I headed to the restroom a short time later, I learned that the room of the deceased patient was the one that the child had pointed to last night. The reason I know this is that there is a space near the restrooms where patients and their families can relax, and I happened to overhear some patients talking there. He said that the person in the hospital room was originally in poor health, and it was not surprising that it could have died at any time. A short time later, I left the hospital, and during my discharge, I saw the child in the patient gown several times. And I noticed that there were several common signs that a child would appear. One is that there is a mortal person. This came to me from the case of a patient who passed away, and I actually remember the first hospital room where I saw the child and went to check it out. However, I learned that the patient in that room had already passed away. The other is that kid tells a person who will be involved in the accident. When I was in the hospital, I observed a young man with one broken leg, and for some reason, the child appeared at his side and pointed at him. I was anxiously observing the man, and then he stumbled and fell down the stairs. Fortunately, the man did not seem to be in life-threatening pain, but it seemed to be heavily painful. In addition, an elderly woman was fingered by the child and died of pneumonia a few days later after catching a cold. I have found that being pointed at by the child does not necessarily lead to death, but it is still creepy. Having thus come to an understanding of the child, I wondered what I could do about the child's pranks after I left the hospital, and I have tried several times to prevent accident or someone's death. One day, the child came to my classmate, A. Mr. A is a healthy boy by all accounts, and today he looked healthy enough to play an active role in a basketball game. On the way home, I was following A as he left with another friend. Then, just before approaching an intersection, A exchanged greetings with his friend and suddenly started running. He was also running while turning towards his friend and waving his hand, so A did not seem to notice that the light ahead had already turned back to red. I shouted, "A!" When his name is suddenly called, A hesitantly turns back to face forward and staggers to stop just short of the crosswalk. At that moment, a large truck passes by, almost touching A's shoulder. A screamed and fell down. A was just startled by the wind pressure and the sound of running and fell down, but did not seem to be injured. While I was feeling relieved that A was safe, the child reappeared at A's side. Then the kid turned to me and stared at me. Seeing such a child, I was puzzled that I had perhaps done something terrible. A few days later, as I got up and went down the living room as usual, I almost fell into despair. Seeing my pale face, my mother asked, "What's wrong? Are you sick?" She put her hand on my forehead, but I could not take my eyes off the child behind her. I saw the child's face up closer for the first time. The child's face was sore, as if it had been burned with chemicals, and frankly, it was impossible to determine the facial parts. The child's facial parts and skin had melted. The child's nose looked like a crushed fig, and I felt nauseous just looking at it. But as I put my hand over my mouth to hold back the nausea, the child's mouth, I guess, grins as it opens like a mouth, making a mitch, mitch, mitch sound, as if peeling off a healing pressure sore. He then pointed a finger at my mother, who was worried about me. The next moment, I was passed out. When I woke up, I was tucked into bed in my room. My mother told me that I had a high fever and was having a nightmare. But the moment my mother said she was going to buy medicine, I remembered the child, and despite my fever, I jumped up and clung to her and desperately begged her not to go. My mother lowered her eyebrows in annoyance and said, "Well, but we have to go get some groceries for dinner." But I suddenly almost came up to ask her on my knees to not to leave the house, just for today. Being amazed, my mother said, "Well, all we have is instant noodles. Is that okay?" I was very happy, because I would have been happy with anything as long as my mother didn't go out. When my father came home that night, the first thing he said was, "Did you feel any different?" He asked us, or rather my mother. When my mother asked my father what was wrong, He told her that he had just heard a neighbor say that there has been a purse snatching in the neighborhood, and that a woman whose bag had been snatched had been hit on the back of the head when she fell down unluckily and was transported by an ambulance. Moreover, the time of the incident was during the time my mother usually went out to buy groceries. My mother, upon hearing this, told my father that I had begged her not to let me go out today, and my father laughed and said, "You are a spoiled brat too," and patted my head, but both of them whispered, "Strange things do happen." Anyway, as I was relieved that my mother was safe, I noticed that the kid had reappeared behind my parents, chatting, and was glaring at me resentfully. But this time, I glared back at the child, not being outdone, and the child quickly disappeared from the scene without doing anything. Since then, the child has never appeared in my family's presence, but I often see the child pointing his finger at residents in the city. I don't know if that child is like the Grim Reaper who signals misfortune, or if misfortune befalls us because that child points the finger at us. I just hope that a child will not appear in front of my closed ones.